All right, welcome to another episode of the Warriors Walk podcast. I'm Keith and this is Todd. Today we're going to be talking about the future of ministry and how we empower teenagers. So stay tuned. Now, Todd, you and I are passionate about youth ministry, student ministry, and in fact, you were, before you went into the SEALs, you were studying to become a youth pastor, correct?
Correct.
And what led to that? Like, what was the draw to want to do youth ministry even before your military career?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a couple factors. One, I had two godly grandfathers that loved the Lord. One served as a pastor, the other one was a deacon in his church, and so they influenced me greatly. And then I had a wonderful youth pastor who actually led me to the Lord. I was one of those little kids that went forward when they were 5 in my grandfather's church, but I just didn't remember it enough. So when I was 16, I was sitting in a Wednesday night service, and our youth pastor, Mark Roy, he didn't make it easy on me or anyone else present. There's about 100 kids there, and he says, you know what? I just feel led, like if one of you want to follow the Lord tonight, stand up.
Yeah.
I was like, stand up? Normally they play music, and you get to walk down an aisle and stuff. And I stood up. And then he spent about an hour with me in his office, and we solidified that assurance of salvation through Scripture. And I wanted to be like him, to be honest. Like, I looked up to my youth pastor. And so that was the initial genesis to get me started. And then, of course, I got a wild hair and went in and did a different type of youth ministry in the SEAL teams for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
And then full circle, getting out to do youth ministry in the church that we serve in today.
Yeah. And that's how you came on staff at our church, was through the youth ministry. And then we even joke around and say that you're a youth pastor with big boy clothes on now.
Well, I remember when I first arrived here a little over 8 years ago, I just told the church, because they selected me and petitioned the elders, and I said, well, I'm a one-trick pony, like I'm a youth pastor, so you're now my new youth group. They all laughed, but I had two ladies that were over 90, they're sisters, and they walked down front and they grabbed my elbow, they pulled me down to them, and they're like, finally somebody gets us.
Yeah.
And so that made me feel good, because I think at some point we all realize there's a part of us that never grows up, and we do want to stay young.
Definitely. Yeah, in my experience, I came to Christ as a teenager as well. So seeing the gospel transform my older brother's life, and then I started to do youth ministry, but it was just ministry to me. Like, I just started to lead my friends to Christ and do Bible studies and disciple them. And it wasn't until there was a guy in our church who was just kind of seeing, all the stuff that I was doing with my peers and stuff in high school. He was like, have you considered going to youth ministry? And at the time I was going to a church that was really small. We only had a senior pastor on staff, and that was volunteer-led, everything else. And so I had never known that you could actually be paid to be youth pastor. So when he's like, you should pursue youth ministry, and I was like, well, I'd have to get a job too. And he's like, no, like you can actually like get a job at a church doing this. And I was like, what? Like I was just blown away that was a possibility. So then I studied youth ministry and been working youth ministry in some capacity ever since. But so that's definitely been close to both of our hearts, and it's kind of why we have been united in many ways. Like, we're definitely on the same page when it comes to student ministry and how we reach more teenagers. And so today we're not going to just talk about the programmatic aspect of youth ministry, but really how we really focus on equipping teenagers. And there's been different seasons of youth ministry. And of course, this episode's not designed to be an exhaustive, history of youth ministry, but we're gonna. I'd like to just explain kind of where we are youth ministry wise with our country and just kind of the state of the church right now. But before we dive into some of the stuff with that, do you have a story of impact that you could share when it comes to youth ministry, that just when you think of youth ministry fondly, you think of some of the impact stories that you've seen?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's so many, but one that stands out, and I was sharing with you earlier, for those listening, when we run a camp, our summer camps are pretty big, so we're taking at least 600 teenagers, and it's just full-on chaos, controlled chaos. But we had a pretty strict policy, and Keith and I and others, we figured out a fun way to share the rules with the students. I would slow jam the rules with the band, and I didn't even know what slow jam meant. The band had to teach me what that was. But we had one. The one was kind of fun was, just like, about boys and girls rooms and girls and boys rooms. And, of course, we would just say, boys, you're walking on by and that door's open. You see that girl and she's on fire, like literally on fire. What do you do? And they were like, bomb, 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 bomb. You just walk on by and let her burn. and they laughed, but they got the point. You're not to go in each other's rooms.
Yeah.
But we also had a very strict drug policy. Any drugs brought to camp, and you were going home on mom and dad's dime. It was far enough away, they had to fly them home. And I remember the very first night, one of the female volunteers brought in a young lady, and they were just a boo-hooing, and she basically got caught with drugs as they were unpacking and stuff like that. And she was just looking there like, okay, send me home. And I was like, you know what? I just feel led to keep you here. I love you that much, so you're not going home. And she screamed and hollered and yelled and did her very best to make an impression that she be sent home according to the rules. And I said, well, good news is I also get to enforce this wonderful thing called grace. And so we're going to show you some grace. And the transformation did not happen overnight. And certainly I had a long phone call with mom and a lot of tears and a lot of pain. But today, this young lady serves around the world as a medical missionary. And so for those listening that are in youth ministry, I would just say stay the course with those problem kids because they need Christ more than any of them. And when they get on fire, my goodness, stand by.
Yeah. Yeah. Similarly, we had middle school students. So when I first started on staff at McLean, I was the middle school director at Tyson's, and we had this one kid. He was rowdy. I mean, he was off the charts. He would get in trouble all the time. He's the one that was always talking while someone was teaching the lesson or whatever. And so, but we stuck with him, always kept him in the loop. And there was even I remember one missions trip that we had to, his dad actually came to us and was like, hey, he's not allowed to go anymore because of his behavior. And so we're like, okay, bullet dodged. Like we missed that. So he had to stay home. I think that summer he went to like a military school or something like that. So ideally, was part of our group, all throughout middle school and high school. And, he ended up really loving the Lord and surrendering his life, becoming a student missionary at one of our campus missions that we did, with the Edge Club, and was a student leader there, like killing it, leading his friends to the Lord, to the point where he went off to college and studied youth ministry, and now he's a youth pastor in our area. So you know how I'm talking about, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I won't say his name just to embarrass him, but yeah, it was a cool transformation of just seeing a honorary little middle school boy now becoming an adult that's serving the Lord faithfully as a youth pastor at another church. So when it comes to the stories of impact, that motivates us to keep going, right? To see those life transformations, and so the purpose of this episode was really designed to kind of say, we talked on this last episode about people that are trying to serve and just not knowing where to start, and so we're going to highlight some different types of ministry, student ministry being the first one, as we're both passionate about it as well, of just ways the why behind teenage ministry. So a lot of times people are terrified of teenagers. In fact, when I meet someone and they ask me what I do and I tell them I'm a youth pastor, they're like, "Oh, is that like court ordered, or like you have to work with teenagers?" I'm like, no, like I actually love it. Like I actually, it's where it's at. And I really believe that Jesus was intentional about selecting teenage disciples as well. So when we look at when Jesus and disciples went into Jerusalem to pay the temple, they paid the temple tax, and only Jesus and Peter paid the temple tax. And when you cross-reference that back, there was a certain age and above that you had to be to pay the temple tax. And so that kind of demonstrates that Jesus selected mainly teenagers to change the world. And we look at past revivals, large majority of them is started by young people. And I have some theories on that too, now that we know a little bit more about brain development. So, like the full frontal cortex isn't really developed until they're about 25. Mm-hmm. And so, when it comes to students, like they're willing to go all in for Christ and not, it's like there's the negative aspect where they're making unwise decisions, but then there's also the boldness that we see with teenagers that adults don't have once they convince themselves otherwise, So we see teenagers that are being impacted, and then we have so many born again believers, depending on what stat you hear, whatever, it's always at least 2/3 of born again Christians came to faith before they're 18. So there's a narrowing window, not that they can't be led to Christ after they graduate high school, but there's a narrowing window of opportunity that it gets harder once they do. And so that all the whys of youth ministry are there. And then we see that there's even a new challenge in today's day and age where, because of, or since COVID, there's some alarming stats with mental health that's coming out, where 1 in 10 students will attempt suicide. So if 10 teenagers, probably one of them statistically is contemplating or will attempt suicide. And so just to see, the overwhelming need there for discipleship to be happening, for the gospel to be the hope that teenagers have, that we don't have to be convinced of, because we've seen the transformative power of youth ministry. But when it comes to youth ministry nowadays, like it's a different season for youth ministry, I think. If you go back to even youth ministry where it kind of started, it wasn't, there's nothing about youth ministry in scripture. Like as far as, when we even look at some of the verses, like, of course we see that Jesus used young people, that, culturally, teenagers were, they're considered adults, once they turn 13. And so when it comes to like youth ministry programming or having a youth pastor, there's not specific language in scripture about that. So then the question arises, like, when did youth ministry happen? And do you know some of the history with youth ministry in America, at least where that was formed?
Some, but nothing that I would want to quote on a podcast.
So I think, I mean, unless I'm not like an historian or anything, but I'm pretty sure that the rise of like youth ministry programming, like in other words, where a church would hire a youth pastor or even a volunteer leader would lead a youth ministry specific programming, was a result of the Jesus movement.
That's the one that came to my mind.
Yeah, so 60s, 60s and 70s in America, where there was such an increase of young people coming to Christ, they needed people to invest in the next generation because they didn't have enough adults to one-on-one disciple teenagers. And we also saw, because ideally God's plan A was the family, to be discipleship of children.
Still is, right?
And yeah, it still is. And but we have students now that are coming to Christ and their family is not godly, or they're not, taking that ownership of their faith to invest in their students. And so that's why we have, youth pastors and youth leaders and stuff to invest in students. And so even a good youth ministry program at a church is kind of both, so like there's kind of a pendulum swing sometimes where it's like, well, youth ministry is in the Bible, so we're just going to swing all the way to the right, where it's like we're just having the families disciple their own teenagers, which is still great and needed and valuable, and we need to do that more. But it's at the expense of reaching lost teenagers, teenagers that don't have families that would invest in them spiritually. And so I think a good youth ministry kind of provides both. It comes alongside of and equips parents to disciple their teens, but also has an outreach component where we're equipping teenagers to share their faith. And so different stages. I'd be curious to know, like, when you became a Christian as a teenager, what was youth ministry like then? Like, could you describe like what was youth ministry like? Maybe some of the people that are listening or watching this could relate to different seasons that we have. But I think we have the Jesus movement where it was just like the Wild West. Like they were basically trying to keep up with, the increase of new believers that were young people. But then once you kind of establish different, seasons of, okay, you're now 10 years, 20 removed or whatever from the Jesus revolution. And so what was it like in it was the 80s, correct?
Yeah. Well, 70s, 80s.
70s, 80s. Okay.
Yeah. So I would say it was what you and I would call today pretty generic, in that we did have, Sunday morning where it was like a big group, like we were all together. Yeah. And then they had enough volunteers where they could farm us out into gender age appropriate groups to break down the discussion further. Yeah. And so that was pretty cool. And we were in a pretty big church at the time, so we would have some interesting guest speakers come in. And then we had Wednesday night, and I remember when I got older and actual legit youth ministry, it was called the Joy Explosion. And I loved how the youth pastor, he was just a big fan of Philippians, and I am too. But he's like, listen, if you put Jesus first, then others, and then yourself, and you keep that order correct, you will have joy. And so that was a good framework for us young minds that the frontal lobe wasn't fully developed. Yeah. But talking about the other thing that was pretty cool was our church, and I don't know statistically if this was normal for most churches at the time, but they were locally and globally minded. And so I remember doing a mission trip when I graduated high school, and we didn't go to an unreached people group, but we went to Canada, which, that's close. No offense, my Canadian friends. But we did go to Saskatchewan, and we basically helped build a church during the summer there, and we went door to door each day. And I was paired up. I was one of the oldest guys there, and then I was paired up with this ornery junior high kid that was 12 years old, probably the most obnoxious human on earth. But going back to that boldness you talked about, he loved God, but he just didn't know what he was doing. And I tried to keep him from speaking too much, but I remember counting. I kept a journal, and so he and I knocked on 1,000 doors in our time there. We had 999 slammed on us. Next to last door, this big mountain man opens the door, and I start sharing with him. He's like, I'd like to know more. Come on in. I'm like, oh no, like
Like,
this
what do
guy
we do
wants
now?
us to come in. He's an axe murderer.
Yeah.
Well, turns out he was a lineman for the Canadian Football League, and he's a big old guy. And so we started sharing Christ with him, and he just started bawling like a baby. And we're kids, right? This guy's big old beard down his chest, and we were scared. But to see God move on his heart, I think it just reinforced in our hearts, like it's not us, it's the word of God that is the power. And that was the only fruit I saw from the whole trip. I heard about other examples, but that really reinforced in my mind just how important youth ministry is in activating young people.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make sense that a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old boy can knock on a door and a lineman would open it up and come to know Christ.
Yeah.
Like if you and I were putting together the A team, we wouldn't send those two to go visit a football player.
Yeah.
And yet God in his wisdom was like, yeah, I'm going to take the foolish things of this world and just show what I can do through foolish people.
Yeah. That's awesome.
So it was pretty cool.
Yeah. And even when I was, kind of the tail end of the 90s in youth group, I mean, it looked a little bit different. Like there was, we were a small church plant, and so my experience was very personal. Like we knew everybody, like we did everything together. It was just volunteer run. But there was some guys in our church that just, they were deacons, and they just took responsibility for me and some other guys just investing in us. And so they would teach us the Bible, and they would go out with, we did door knocking. We'd, do door-to-door evangelism. And I learned how to share the gospel, from them. And that's what solidified a lot of us. But there was a group of about 5 or 6 of us guys, and then one of our youth leaders that we met outside of our regular programming, where it was just like a discipleship. We called it like I forget, it was called the circle or something like weird like that, where we just we met and we held each other accountable to reading our Bibles and sharing the gospel and shared prayer requests. So we, just that tight knit group of guys was what my primary experience was for youth group, in youth ministry, those early days. And then of course, when I joined McLean staff, I went from a church that I was serving at in youth ministry there was about 200 people total in the church. And then I went from that to being in charge of a middle school ministry that was about 250 middle schoolers. And so talking about a culture shock of like, whoa, this is, and back then, and you remember some of this too, like the early 2000s, like that was a big attractional model. So the 90, it was just like, let's see, what's the biggest thing we can do to attract students to come to our programs or our events, and then we'd share the gospel with them. And that was like the model. And we saw people come to Christ, and we saw people that would just attend the events because they wanted to see something cool, and then they wouldn't respond to the gospel. And so I think we're in a new season now in ministry where we have to be more grassroots about equipping students. So for us to have not an addition mindset where we're just, who can shoot a poodle out of a cannon the first, and that's, what's going to try. It's like, because we can draw a crowd. We've learned that we can draw a crowd. You can give away iPads. You can, if you have a budget, you can draw a crowd. But what often happens is, you win them too. So in other words, they're there because of the iPad, not because they want to learn about Jesus.
Right.
And so we've really shifted our focus now in our youth ministry to really equipping students to share the gospel, not invite your friends to youth group so the youth pastor can share the gospel. And so because of that mindset, we've seen a whole new activation. I think it's almost like going back to how we experienced youth group, where it was like we did the evangelism, like we shared the gospel. It wasn't just like, and in fact, I never remember even thinking, I need to invite my friends so that my youth leader can share the gospel with them. Like, it was just like, why would I do that? Like, when I can just share the gospel with my friend. And so I think there's been ebbs and flows of trends in youth ministry. And I think we're at a season now where we need to have a more conversational approach to to sharing the gospel and equipping students to do that, to empowering them. And not just, come here to see what we can do, or, if you build it, they'll come. Like, if you have an event, or if you build an awesome youth room, like, those days are kind of over now. In fact, you can have, just a hole in the wall, place to meet. But if students know that you care about them and that you're equipping them, for the work of the ministry, I think they're going to be activated a lot more. So with that, we have a real focus here, at our church, of really just making sure that students know how to share the gospel and they know that language. And so we talk about urgency, gospel urgency. We talk about gospel fluency, knowing how to share the gospel. And we talk about the gospel strategy of just really, being on the public school campus, if they're in public school, if they're homeschooled or Christian schooled, like, one, we know that if you go to a Christian school, it doesn't mean that all of your friends are Christian, right? And so even the homeschool people in our ministry, they're finding ways and developing hobbies and joining sports teams or, hobbies and stuff to share the gospel with people that they can interact with. And so because of that focus, we've really seen more of an empowerment of the teenagers, not just an attractional, model to invite them to. So, yeah. Now, when it comes to someone that might be out there right now and they're like, I'm still kind of in that category where I'm terrified of teenagers and I'm not sure if this is for me. What are some easy steps that might happen for them to see, that they can fit into, like, in other words, do you have to devote all your time? You have to give your cell phone number out to a teenager so that they're like going to text you or something at all hours of the night? Like, what is an easy way to start where, people might be that are not serving right now?
Yeah. I'll just go back to the conversations I had with volunteers. Someone was a man or a woman was interested. I like breaking it down, and it was a little bit of comedy, but it's also, I think, a little bit of truth. I said, well, let me frame what junior high and high school looks like. I said, the easiest way I know to explain it is junior high kids will look at you and say, do you like me? And so that's their mindset. They're approaching it. Where high school kids will come to the table and say, do I like you? Mm-hmm. And something amazing happens between that 8th and 9th grade brain where all of a sudden they become know-it-alls. And so I think that's good framework for them to understand, like, what do they feel more inclined to serve, because that's the demographic and the personality. Yep. But then it's like anything, meeting with men and women in the church that are afraid to do discipleship. Mm-hmm. They're like, well, I'm not qualified. I'm like, actually, I think you are. Like, we'll take a man or a woman who's already raised a family, and say they're in their 50s or 60, and they don't feel qualified to meet with a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, think of all the things you've learned in the past 3 decades that you would love to have known at this age of 20 or 30. Definitely. So you're more than qualified. And then I think that's where I encourage them. It goes back to what you said earlier. The one thing you can't fake is, do you love me? And so if you show up and you care about these kids, it may take time to earn their trust, but eventually, like, that is going to be a life-changing relationship for you and for them. And so that's the stuff that kept me in the trenches on those hard days where you're like, my goodness, this is a brat. And you just like going, we both had those days where we're like, we need therapy because of some of the kids we worked with. But knowing that, like, it's worth persevering and pushing through.
Definitely.
And I would say this canvases any relationship, right? Yeah. Any relationship is going to have challenges, but the sweet spot is when you push through those challenges and it just brings you tighter together. Yeah. I think falling back to the military experience, I think all of us guys, the stories we share, we don't share any story where, like, remember when the weather was perfect and nothing went wrong? Like, nobody remembers any of those days. We had them, but what we like to share is, like, remember when it was blowing 120 miles an hour and we almost got blown off the cliff, and then there was an avalanche, and then we almost died, and, like, that was awesome. Like, and so it's the same thing. Like, that's youth ministry, right? Like, there are going to be days where it feels like that windstorm and it's an avalanche, but then when you come out on the other side, you're like, that was awesome. Yeah. Because then you're going to see things that only God can do. Yep. And that's the best.
Definitely. And so, in your opinion, is there anybody that's too old for youth ministry?
No.
Yeah. Okay. So, there might be people out there, they're like, oh, I'm not a young 20-something-year-old person, so I can't really relate to the kids. And we've seen time and time again that, some of our best leaders are ones that are, more seasoned.
Already raised children.
Yeah. And so, we like to say, like, teenagers, they do have what we call a crap detector. Like, they can tell if you're faking it or if you're, if you just don't really care about them, but if you're genuinely loving them, they don't care about your experience or how old you are. Yeah. I think there's definitely, room for you to serve. So one of the ways that you can definitely serve, even if you can't give your time to serving or your treasures or your time, is praying, right? You can pray for the next generation, pray that they would love the Lord, pray for all these students that are facing mental health crisis right now, that are contemplating suicide and they're struggling with mental disorders that weren't really a big thing when we were growing up. And so even when it comes to, digital screen addictions and the different identity issues that are present in our culture now, where people are questioning what gender they are and what, sexuality they are and all this different stuff. And so pray for this next generation and really kind of see that students aren't the future of the church. We talk about the future of ministry and how the shift is becoming more empowering teenagers rather than attracting teenagers. I think the future of teenagers is not that they will become the church. they are the church now. Like we
Mm-hmm.
are seeing that they are the church now, and they can actually set the pace for a lot of adults when it comes to how they're living out their faith.
Well,
And
and
so,
even think
yeah,
about Sunday and worship, right? It did my heart good. Like half the stage was minors.
yeah,
Half the stage. They're up
absolutely.
there. And, are they studio musicians? Probably not. I don't have an ear to be able to determine that. But I love the fact that I see them up there helping us lead worship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so, yeah, pray for them. Pray for, the Christian students that are trying to live out their faith in schools. Pray for the lost students in our area. But we have 200,000 teenagers in a 4-county radius around our church right now.
Mm.
And what would it look like, for us to really equip students to where every one of those teenagers heard the gospel from a friend. So pray for those Christian students that are going to be sharing with them in the next several years. But that narrowing window of opportunity, right? Because when they turn 18, when they graduate high school, it just gets a little bit harder to reach them because of, just some of the stats that'll show that.
One thing too before we leave this is,
Yeah.
I think for parents listening, we've talked about this briefly before, I believe, but it's so important that you remember, like, you have the lion's share.
Mm-hmm.
The church at best is 5% of the solution. Like
Yeah.
mom and dad, grandpa and grandma, like you guys are the ones that are investing 7 days a week in them. We're coming along and echoing prayerfully the same message that you are. But just know, like, the most influential people in a teen's life is still their family.
Yeah.
Mom and dad, whether you think so or not, they still hear you.
Absolutely.
And so stay the course and then find a church that is supportive and echoing these same values and principles that Keith and I are talking about. And that is the gospel, discipleship,
Yep.
worship, all these things. Like, a lot of times people are looking for the secret sauce, and it's like Kung Fu Panda, right? Let's quote the great theologian, like, there is no secret sauce.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just called love.
Mm-hmm.
That's the missing ingredient in a lot of things today.
Yep. Yeah. So definitely commit to praying for this next generation. Two, give financially to youth ministry specific causes. So we love and support Dare to Share, which is equipping literally like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of teenagers around the world to share the gospel
And youth pastors.
Yeah, and how to be more effective in that. So ministries like Dare to Share, and you have campus ministries like Fellowship of Christian Athletes. That's how my brother and I came to Christ. How I met my wife Caroline. At an FCA event. Young Life, they do amazing camps and local clubs, and then of course Edge Club that's local to Virginia here, which is where what I serve in as well. But yeah, all this stuff we can leave you the link stuff below in the description for you guys to know how to give there. But those are youth ministry specific organizations that are advancing the gospel and that are really focused on equipping this next generation. So you can give financially to those, and then of course, last but not least, what we've been talking about is serve. Just start somewhere. If you're at a church that doesn't have a paid youth pastor, look into really considering starting a youth ministry program to care for the teenagers in your church and to equip them to be outreach focused. And Dare to Share has lots of resources on even how to lead youth ministry. So a book by our friend Greg Steer called Gospelize.
Awesome.
It's just like the 7 values of a gospel advancing youth ministry. So buy that book and start a youth ministry at your church. But if you already have a youth ministry program, go to the youth leader or whoever's running it and ask what are your biggest needs? How can I support you? And we have
Mm-hmm.
specific needs for that even in our own youth ministry. For quality leaders to help with camps and with with events that we have, but also just that week in and week out small group leaders that we need to invest in the students, which is the highest level of commitment, but it's also the most rewarding because we see the transformation happen right before our eyes. So pray, give, serve. Anything else that you would add to someone that might be on the fence if they should dive into youth ministry?
I think the one thing that comes to mind is that same church in San Diego I spoke about previously, where I started doing tables and chairs. They approached me and said, "Hey, we heard that you did a little youth ministry before you came into the military. Would you help us start a youth group?" And I was like, "You know what? Yeah, I will." And I was able to, usually I got off early enough on Friday that I did like a Friday Night Live type thing, to get the youth in there. And it was very radical. We got together and we read through books of the Bible and we prayed. And it was transformational. And we started with like 6 kids and went to 14, then 24, then 48. Next thing you know, like in this small country church, we had about 80 kids that were showing up on Friday to sit around the Word of God and pray. And then to activate them, that was the other thing, is like to get them out in their community and to help them understand. And this goes for all the listeners, like give them the tools to share the gospel. Because a lot of times, and I was that person too, if I could get this one pastor to share with my friend, but I've come to realize, like, if anything, as pastors, there's a certain audience that won't listen to us now. Like, we don't have we don't have the ability to come and speak to someone. Like as a Navy SEAL, I could share Christ with anybody, and they were just perplexed that a Navy SEAL was a follower of Christ first. But then they would listen because of my background.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the introduction is, hey, meet my pastor, they're like, well, you're supposed to talk about God.
Yeah.
And so when you have a young person sharing with a young person who knows them, they see how they live their life in the school, they have a lot more street cred than me as a pastor or you.
Yeah.
So I would just encourage you, like, don't overthink starting, but Gospelize is a great book for principles, but open up and start reading through the Gospels and pray and look what God will do.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so a couple rapid fire questions. One, we've been to lots of camps over the years, and so was there one particular camp story that stands out as one of the craziest?
Yes, there's one.
That
I
you
believe.
can share.
Yeah, no, I can share all of them. They weren't that bad. But yeah, one of the last camps I did, and you recall it well. The camp on their website said, "Hey, we do a fireworks show," and I was like, "Well, I'll take you up on that. Let's do a fireworks show as the grand crescendo, to finish this camp." And during the camp while we were there, they knew I was a SEAL, and they're like, "Hey, would you like to do it?" And I was like, "No, like you guys are the pros. I don't do fireworks. I do bigger explosions." And so, no, hard pass on that. You guys set it up 3 different times. They asked 3 different times. I said no. And eventually they set up. What I didn't know is they set up in a different location than they normally do. Normally they do it on a beach that's quite a bit recessed from the students and the camp. And instead they did it in this inner perimeter where all the cabins are around it. And so no big deal. I was actually treating a couple of dehydrated kids in the little nursing station just beside this little expedition of fireworks. And then I hear the fireworks going off, and I was like, that's cool. I still have a crying kid here, so I'm dealing with him. And then I hear screams. And it was a different type of scream, not a scream of joy, but scream of pain. And so I had my wife stay with the kid, and I walked out there, and I realized, like, all the mortar rounds from the fireworks, they didn't mount them, and so they were going horizontally into the crowd of the teenagers and the volunteers. And it was chaos. And so I realized these guys were still lighting off the fireworks. So I ran and dodged mortars the best I could, maybe took a couple close rounds. And then I get in there and I just grab a hold of them, like, stop lighting the fireworks, man. You're like lighting up the kids. And then it was called rounding up the wounded. I mean, they had scattered into the woods. My own daughter, who was a volunteer, jumped on some girls. She took a round in the back of the head. Her hair caught on fire. And it did do my dad heart pretty good. Like, she came up to me afterwards and she's like, "Dad, that was awesome." I was like, it's too soon. Like, keep that to yourself. I love you, but let's not advertise that right now. But the damage had been done.
Yeah.
We had just enough cell coverage there that kids were posting on social media. So I had to drive off the camp, notify leadership, and I said, stand by for a storm. And thankfully, the church had a good lawyer and reminded the camp that they need to pay for all these medical bills because they're the ones that made a big mistake. They got it all straightened out and everybody made nice. Yep. But that was pretty chaotic and
that
pretty
was
unusual.
Pretty crazy, yeah.
Yeah, that was memorable.
Yeah. And one of the ones that stuck out to me, it's funny because we even had just in this last camp, we had a bus incident where buses all just, even though we confirmed the time, everything, they showed up 2 hours late. And we're all just standing outside, and the camp had already, closed down the cabins and stuff that we had just departed. So, but one of the craziest time we've had with buses, we had hired a bus company to take us down to Myrtle Beach. Was, when we still did Beach Week down there, and we only needed, I think it was 9 buses total, between all of our locations.
I remember the year.
Yeah. And we counted, we went through 36 different buses that
I was going to guess 40.
4 or 5 days that we were there. So, buses were breaking down. We had everything from flat tires to overflowing toilets to AC not working to bus drivers quitting.
Yeah.
We had one bus driver that was suspected of drinking, and so it was a mess. But it was to the point where after, just mainly it was on the ride down, we had all these issues.
All of them.
And it was to the point where it's like every time the phone rang, we were like, it almost felt like Job, where it's like, oh yeah, and your other son just died. Oh, and your other son, it's just like, what is going on? Like, it was just almost laughable how many different things were going wrong. And so then we had to contract another bus company while we were down there to transport us around. And then we had to contract another bus company to take us back. And so because of that, we, it was a chaotic camp. But what was fascinating about that specific, and I just even was talking to a leader that serves in our ministry recently, and they were like, that was the camp that I gave my life to Christ, like when I was a student. Like it was a very spiritually impacting camp, even though we
Wow.
had so many issues with the, and that was the year we didn't have any discipline issues. Like we didn't send any kids home, like
Not
because
being able to use a toilet for 8 hours caused a spiritual moment.
there was definitely a spiritual, emphasis on that particular,
Yeah.
camp. I mean, not that other ones weren't, but
Sure.
it seemed like that was, the Lord used the circumstances to really focus the attention of the students. So,
Well, the lesson learned for me as the leader of that
yeah.
monstrosity was don't go with the lowest bidder to save money. And so we went back
Ended
with
up
the
costing a lot
reputable
of money.
company
Yep.
from then on,
Yep. Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. And then, okay, so one last one before our survival tip today, but what is one of the weirdest youth ministry moments? Do you have any weird story? And if you want, I have one already teed up if you wanted more time to think.
I mean, the weird ones come to me that are humorous. I love doing games, and so I was leading the games at camps. And goodness, there's so many of them. One of them that stands out, I meant it like as a fun, easy thing, and it became something else. But I had husband and wife volunteers build each other banana splits. I said, just build the dream banana split. And they thought that was the goal of the game.
Yeah.
It was not. They should have seen the plastic on the floor and had a clue. And then I was like, that's great. Now husbands lay down on the floor, and I blindfolded them. I said, now your wife is going to feed you the banana split with her feet. Well, what I didn't know is one of the key volunteers had a extreme phobia of feet. And he was dry heaving every time his wife touched him with her feet with the banana split stuff. And she was getting mad because it was embarrassing her that he was dry heaving every time she touched him. And it created a marriage counseling situation that I had to address after. So that one was fun. And then a couple other ones that are just, there was one, I don't know if you remember, we did, I forget what I called it, but basically I had all these hermit crabs on stage. And I was going to have a guy and a girl race across the stage blindfolded, to see if they could get across without smashing a hermit crab. And the girl looked a little apprehensive, but nothing that was a big deal. And then once we blindfolded them, I said, now get ready. I had volunteers scoop all the hermit crabs, and they threw fortune cookies all over the place. As soon as they started, it was just like crunch, crunch, and then she'd start bawling her eyes out because she knew she just killed all these hermit crabs.
Yeah.
And I had to defuse that one too. So it was maybe an epic game fail.
Yeah.
I have hundreds of epic game fails, but those are some of the weird moments that were fun.
Well, I had there was a time where I stepped in to lead a 6th grade boys group, and the leader was out that week, and so we were talking, and I had I forget how we even got on this topic, but we were talking about different things that that were kind of graduating out of believing. So I was like, like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and Tooth Fairy, and the one kid, his eyes lit up. He goes, "My mom's the Tooth Fairy." And we're all like, well, I mean, like everybody's mom's the Tooth Fairy. Like, I mean, and he's like, no, like I was in my mom's closet and I found a bag with thousands of teeth. And I was like, your mom's a serial killer, not the Tooth Fairy. I was like, how does she have thousands of teeth?
A dentist.
Yeah. And still like, why would you have that many teeth? And so I should have asked a lot more follow-up questions from there, but I was just so mortified that his mom had thousands of teeth hidden in her closet.
Where's that fall in mandatory reporting?
Yeah, I don't know, but when it comes to the idea of like I've even played the scenario out, like why would you have thousands of teeth? How did you obtain thousands of teeth? It had to have been a gross exaggeration. I'm hoping. Yeah,
Let's go with hope.
Yeah, I mean, even if you collected all of your children's teeth over the years,
Wouldn't have been thousands.
it'd been maybe 100. I mean, that's not, yeah. So that was one of the weirdest youth ministry moments that I had. I was like, okay, I have to keep eyes on this guy, and his mom at least. Yeah. So
That's
weirdest youth
awesome.
ministry moment. All right, so let's close with a survival tip.
All right. So this one might be something that comes across as just too common sense, but I think it's one of those things that's so practical nobody does it, and it's just fire home safety. And so, those fire alarms are there for a reason, and they're a really great tool. And if you use, the daylight savings and fallback and all that, and just change your batteries twice a year just to make sure you have good batteries, that's a good start. But then the other thing is, for those that have families, is do you have a fire evacuation plan? Does everybody know what to do? And a lot of people today, they have homes with second story. And so Do you have the ability to get out a window? Do you have ladders? Like you and your wife, do you have a plan where like one of you goes down, the other one sends the kids down, especially a smaller one, right? That maybe it's not safe for them to climb. Do you have a rope where you just tether them and lower them down? So having those type of plans to get out of the second story window is wise, but also a rally point. Like sometimes things get chaotic. Maybe it's you wake up and the fire's already just completely consumed your home. Like once you've obtained your children and your wife, or even if you're just by yourself or another buddy, like if you got a roommate, like where are you rallying at to make sure you got a head count and that you're good? Yeah. And so those type of things, even like, is it, possible to grab an electronic? If it's a certain time of year where it's extremely cold outside, can you snatch some blankets or, some jackets, things like that? Granted, if you're in a neighborhood, I would imagine you have some neighbors that would come to your aid, even if you run out in your boxers type thing and it's freezing cold. But having a fire safety plan is a big deal. Talking about it, even like looking to see, have a fire extinguisher. They even have these really cool blankets now that you can throw over grease fires and stuff like that to extinguish them. And even knowing like what type of fires and how you would fight them. There's certain things in the garage that you're not going to use water on, right? Because it's going to make it worse. And so we don't have time to cover everything, but certainly fire takes out a lot of people. And it's one of those things where they just don't realize, what they're doing in their home. Overloading circuits. They don't have surge protectors. Like there's all these different things, but I would encourage you, rather than, save money, if you don't know what you're doing with electricity, hire a master electrician. Because one, I learned this just through a little research, you could do a lot of home improvement stuff, but if you have a fire and they can trace it to a home improvement job that was not done by a master electrician, your insurance will not cover it. And so it's just not worth skimping and saving $100, if you're not qualified.
And I think about that. There's a popular video soundbite that's going on right now where it's like, who did the electric work here? It's like, oh, my nephew. It's like, when did his house burn down? Wait, how did you know his house burned down? Yeah, it's like, there's some real amateurs out there. You gotta be careful. Yeah, electricity, sure. I don't touch. I don't mess with that stuff. But
I have, and it bites.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, that concludes another episode of The Warriors Walk. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. If you're listening to this on the podcast, make sure you subscribe and follow us so that you'll be up to date with new episodes. So we'll see you next time.